When the police forced open the penthouse store, they found Richard Halston dead beside a dining table set for two. His expensive suit was untouched. His wristwatch still ticked. The wine in his glass hadn't even finished swirling. According to the medical examiner, he had been dead for less than 15 minutes. There was only one problem. Every person who wanted him dead was somewhere else. The building's security system showed no one entering or leaving the penthouse. Every hallway camera worked. Every elevator recorded its passengers. The stairwells required electronic keycards. The apartment had become an impossible crime scene. Detective Daniel Cross arrived just after 11:30. He didn't rush through murder scenes anymore. 22 years in homicide had taught him that killers almost always left something behind. The trick wasn't finding the clue. The trick was recognizing it before someone else erased its meaning. Cross ducked beneath the crime scene tape and paused inside the doorway. Nothing looked disturbed. The penthouse overlooked downtown Seattle through floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain streaked the glass while city lights shimmered across Elliott Bay. Soft jazz still played through hidden ceiling speakers. Someone had died in the middle of a perfectly ordinary evening. "Victims over here," a forensic technician called. Richard Halston lay on polished hardwood flooring beside the dining table. 56 years old. Founder of one of the country's fastest-growing cybersecurity companies. Estimated net worth just over $800 million. One bullet wound. Center of the chest. No weapon nearby. Cross crouched beside the body. There was remarkably little blood. The shot had likely passed cleanly through the heart. Time of death: approximately 10:53, the medical examiner replied. Cross glanced toward the dining table. 2 plates. 2 crystal glasses. 1 untouched steak growing cold. Another half-eaten. Who is he having dinner with? That's what we're trying to figure out. Cross studied the second chair. It had been pushed back neatly. Not knocked over. Not hurried. Whoever sat there had left calmly. Or wanted everyone to believe they had. A uniformed officer approached carrying a tablet. "We identified the people closest to Halston." Cross accepted it. 4 names immediately stood out. Emily Halston. His wife. Marcus Doyle. Business partner. Olivia Grant. Chief Financial Officer. Ryan Mercer. Former employee fired 6 months earlier after accusing the company of fraud. "Where were they?" Cross asked. The officer tapped the screen. Emily was attending a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum. Over 300 guests. Marcus Doyle was giving a live interview on a national business network. Olivia Grant was speaking at a technology conference in San Francisco. Ryan Mercer was in police custody after a bar fight across town. Cross looked up slowly. Every alibi had already been verified. Photographs. Witnesses. Security footage. None of them could have been inside this penthouse at 10:53. Who found the body? Housekeeper. She arrived for the overnight cleaning shift at 11:10. Door was locked from the inside. She used her emergency key after nobody answered. Forced entry? None. Hidden exits? Architect says there aren't any. Cross stood and slowly walked through the apartment. The kitchen gleamed. The office remained untouched. The bedroom looked as though no one had entered it all day. Nothing suggested a struggle. He stopped in front of the massive windows overlooking the city. The rain had become heavier. From 42 stories above the streets, Seattle looked peaceful. Murders rarely happened in peaceful places. They happened where ordinary lives quietly fell apart. Detective. Cross turned. The lead forensic examiner held up a wine bottle sealed inside an evidence bag. "You'll want to see this." "What is it?" 2 sets of fingerprints. Richard Halston. And someone who officially died 3 years ago. For the first time that night, Daniel Cross felt the investigation slipping away from logic. Daniel Cross accepted the evidence bag without taking his eyes off the fingerprints. "Whose prints?" he asked. The forensic examiner hesitated. "A man named Thomas Avery. He was declared dead 3 years ago after his sailboat disappeared near the San Juan Islands." Cross frowned. Declared dead isn't the same as proven dead. The Coast Guard searched for 6 days. They found pieces of the boat, but never recovered a body. His wife eventually had him legally declared deceased. Cross handed the bag back. "Find everything we have on Thomas Avery. Employment. Family. Financial records. Everything." He walked back toward the dining table. Most detectives looked for what didn't belong. Cross preferred looking for what should have been there but wasn't. 2 place settings. 2 wine glasses. 2 cloth napkins. Only 1 dessert plate. He stopped. That didn't fit. "Who served dinner?" he asked. "Private chef. He left around 9:30. "Did he prepare dessert?" "Yes." "For 1 person or 2? The officer checked his notes. 2. Cross looked back at the table. Someone had removed a dessert plate after the meal. Why remove only 1? He carefully examined the polished floor beneath the table. A faint scratch caught his attention. 1 chair had been dragged backward only a few inches. The other hadn't moved at all. He crouched lower. The scratch was fresh, almost invisible unless light struck it from the right angle. "Photograph this," he said. Outside the apartment, Lieutenant Karen Mills waited beside the elevators. She had supervised homicide long enough to recognize the expression on Cross's face. "You already found something." "Maybe. Or maybe the killer wants me to think I did." She handed him a printed report. The building manager confirmed every security camera is working. No outages. No missing footage. Cross skimmed the report. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor. Only 2 elevators reached it. Both required electronic authorization. The emergency stairwell alarm had never been triggered. How many people had access? Richard. His wife. The housekeeper. Building management. Any duplicate keys? None that anyone admits to. Cross folded the report. Someone's lying. About the murder? Mills asked. No. About something much smaller. Those lies are usually more interesting. Just after midnight, Cross visited the security office in the building's basement. Rows of monitors displayed every hallway, lobby, elevator, garage entrance, and loading dock. The technician rewound the footage to 10:30 that evening. Cross watched in silence. Residents entered. Residents left. Delivery drivers arrived with food. Maintenance workers pushed equipment carts through the service corridor. Nothing unusual happened. Then he noticed something so ordinary that everyone else had ignored it. At exactly 10:46, 1 elevator stopped on the 27th floor. The doors opened. No one entered. No one exited. After 6 seconds, the doors closed again. Play that again. The technician replayed the clip. The hallway remained completely empty. Yet the elevator had clearly answered a call. Computer glitch? The technician suggested. Cross slowly shook his head. Elevators don't stop for ghosts. Someone called it. The technician replayed the footage a 3rd time. Cross leaned closer to the monitor. The elevator doors opened. The hallway remained empty. 6 seconds passed. The doors closed. Nothing about the recording appeared unusual. That was exactly what bothered him. Can I see the elevator logs? Cross asked. The technician nodded. Every elevator movement is recorded automatically. He opened another screen filled with timestamps and access records. Cross ignored everything except the stop on the 27th floor. Someone had requested the elevator at 10:46. No keycard had been used. No passenger had been detected by the cabin's weight sensor. Weight sensor? Cross repeated. The system estimates occupancy, the technician explained. It helps the elevators distribute passengers during busy hours. If someone had stepped inside, the system would have recorded the change. Cross stared at the screen. Someone had called an elevator without ever entering it. Print this. Back upstairs, the forensic team continued collecting evidence. The apartment had grown quieter. Most of the photographs had been taken. The victim's body had already been transported to the medical examiner's office. Cross walked slowly through the dining room once more. He stopped beside the wine bottle. 2 fingerprints. One belonged to Richard Halston. The other belonged to a man who supposedly no longer existed. His phone vibrated. Cross. Detective, this is Dr. Elena Brooks. I've completed the preliminary examination. Tell me something useful. The bullet entered from the front. Close range. Less than 3 feet. Death would have been almost immediate. Anything unexpected? There was a brief pause. Yes. Richard Halston had eaten dessert. Cross looked toward the dining table. Only one dessert plate remained missing. You're sure? Chocolate soufflé. It's still present in his stomach. He ate it less than 30 minutes before he died. Cross thanked her and ended the call. He walked back to the table. The private chef had prepared 2 desserts. Richard had eaten one. The second dessert had vanished. Someone had deliberately removed both the plate and every trace that another person had eaten there. Lieutenant Mills stepped into the apartment. We located Emily Halston. Still at the gala? Yes. She's on her way. Anyone verify she stayed there the entire evening? Multiple witnesses. She even gave a speech that was streamed live. Cross nodded. The timeline matched. She couldn't have been inside the penthouse. Unless the timeline itself was wrong. An evidence technician approached carrying a sealed plastic bag. We found this in the kitchen trash. Inside the bag was a white linen napkin. One corner had been burned. Near the center was a faint reddish-brown stain. Blood? Cross asked. We're testing it. Cross unfolded the napkin carefully. Embroidered in one corner were the initials. T.A. Thomas Avery. Cross looked out across the dark Seattle skyline. For years, Thomas Avery had been officially dead. Now his fingerprints had appeared on a wine bottle. His initials had appeared on a linen napkin. And somewhere inside this impossible murder was a connection no one else could yet see. Cross had solved enough murders to recognize one simple truth. Perfect alibis almost never existed. Someone always made a mistake. His job was to find it before the killer realized they already had. Emily Halston arrived just after 1 o'clock in the morning. She stepped out of the black sedan wearing the same navy blue evening gown she had worn at the charity gala. Her makeup was flawless except for the mascara beginning to run beneath her eyes. 2 uniformed officers escorted her through the lobby and into the penthouse. She stopped the moment she entered the dining room. The chair where Richard had been sitting was empty now. The body had already been removed. Only evidence markers and forensic lights remained. I'm Detective Daniel Cross, he said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss. Emily nodded but said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly across the apartment as though searching for something that no longer existed. Mrs. Halston, Cross began, when was the last time you spoke with your husband? Around 10:15. He called while I was at the museum. What did you talk about? Nothing unusual. He asked how the fundraiser was going. I asked if he planned to work all night again. He laughed. That was it. Cross watched her carefully. Her breathing remained steady. Her answers came naturally. She wasn't trying to remember a rehearsed story. Did your husband mention having company? Emily hesitated. No. Was he expecting anyone? Not that I know of. Cross slid a photograph across the dining table. It showed the second-place setting exactly as it had been found. Someone shared dinner with Richard tonight. Emily stared at the photograph. For the first time since arriving, genuine confusion crossed her face. Richard never entertained guests without telling me. Never? Never. Cross made a note. Absolute words like never often caused people trouble later. Do you know a man named Thomas Avery? Emily's expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. Yes, she answered quietly. Cross leaned forward. Tell me about him. Thomas worked with Richard years ago. Before the company became successful. They started the business together. Cross stopped writing. Together? Thomas designed the original security software. Richard handled investors and contracts. What happened? Emily looked toward the rain-covered windows. Thomas disappeared. A year later, Richard bought his shares from the estate. Did anyone question the timing? People talked. No one proved anything. Cross quietly underlined Thomas Avery's name in his notebook. The case had just become more complicated. His phone rang. Lieutenant Mills. Cross. We found Avery's file. Tell me. He wasn't just Richard's business partner. He owned 48% of the company before he disappeared. Cross did the math immediately. At today's valuation, Thomas Avery's shares would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Anything else? Yes. His death certificate was signed without a body ever being identified. Cross slowly looked back toward Emily. If Thomas Avery had never actually died, then one of the wealthiest men in America might have built his fortune on a lie. As he ended the call, another detective entered the apartment carrying a small evidence box. We searched Richard's office. This was hidden inside a locked desk drawer. Cross opened the box. Inside lay an old photograph. 3 young men stood together outside a tiny office building, smiling at the camera. Richard Halston stood in the center. Thomas Avery stood on his right. The third man's face had been carefully cut out with a razor blade. Someone had wanted to erase him. Cross held the photograph beneath the desk lamp. The cut had been deliberate. Clean. Precise. Whoever removed the third man's face had taken their time. When was this found? Cross asked. Inside a locked drawer in Richard's office, the detective replied. There was nothing else with it. Cross turned the photograph over. A date had been written in faded blue ink. April 14, 22 years earlier. Below the date was a short handwritten note. 3 founders. 1 promise. 3 founders. Not 2. Richard Halston. Thomas Avery. And someone whose identity had been erased. By sunrise, Cross had assembled every available record on the company's early history. Most articles praised Richard Halston as a visionary entrepreneur. A few mentioned Thomas Avery as a gifted software engineer. None of them mentioned the third founder. That wasn't an oversight. Someone had rewritten history. At 8 o'clock that morning, Cross visited the company's headquarters. The glass tower overlooked Seattle's waterfront. Employees entered quietly, unaware that their founder had been murdered only hours earlier. Marcus Doyle was already waiting in the executive conference room. His televised interview from the previous evening had given him what appeared to be an airtight alibi. He stood as Cross entered. "Detective. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." "So do I." Marcus was calm, well-dressed, confident without appearing arrogant. He answered every question directly. "How long had you known Richard?" 22 years. "Were you there when the company started?" "Almost. I joined a few months later." Cross placed the old photograph on the table. "Recognize it?" Marcus looked down. For less than a second, his eyes paused on the missing face. Then he looked back at Cross. "No." It was a convincing lie. Almost convincing enough. "You looked at the missing face before you looked at Richard. That tells me you've seen this photograph before." Marcus smiled politely. "You're reading too much into it." "Maybe. Who was the third founder?" The room became silent. Marcus folded his hands. "There wasn't one." "Interesting." Cross slid the photograph back into his folder. "Because the back says there were." Marcus didn't answer. As Cross stood to leave, he noticed something hanging on the conference room wall. A framed award celebrating the company's 20th anniversary. Below it were dozens of employee signatures. One signature caught his attention. P. Avery. Not printed. Handwritten. Fresh ink. Cross walked closer. "When was this signed?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "At the anniversary celebration." 2 years ago?" "That's right." Cross looked back at the signature. Thomas Avery had supposedly been dead for 3 years. Yet someone had signed his name at a company celebration a full year after his reported death. Marcus saw exactly where Cross was looking. For the first time since the interview began. He stopped smiling. Cross didn't mention the signature again. Instead, he thanked Marcus for his time and walked out of the conference room. He didn't want answers yet. He wanted people to believe they had fooled him. As soon as he reached the parking garage, he called Lieutenant Mills. "Run a forensic comparison on Thomas Avery's signature. Compare the one from the anniversary plaque with every historical document you can find." "You think it's genuine?" Mills asked. "I think someone wants us to." 2 hours later, Cross sat across from Olivia Grant in a quiet interview room. The company's chief financial officer looked exhausted. Unlike Marcus, she hadn't tried to project confidence. She looked like someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy. "Did Richard ever talk about Thomas Avery?" Cross asked. Olivia lowered her eyes. "Not after I started working there." "But before?" She hesitated. "There were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "That Thomas believed Richard had stolen more than his company." Cross waited. Silence often encouraged people to keep talking. "Years ago," Olivia continued, "someone anonymously mailed copies of internal financial records to several board members. The documents suggested company shares had been transferred illegally after Thomas disappeared." "Were they authentic?" "No one could prove it. The investigation ended almost as quickly as it started." "Who led the investigation?" "Marcus Doyle." Cross wrote the name in his notebook again. Marcus seemed to appear at every important moment in the company's history. "Why didn't you tell investigators about this last night?" Olivia sighed. "Because I didn't think it mattered. Now I'm not so sure." Before Cross could ask another question, his phone vibrated. Lieutenant Mills. The handwriting lab just finished. Go ahead. The anniversary signature isn't Thomas Avery's. It's an excellent forgery. But it's still a forgery. Cross leaned back in his chair. That meant someone had intentionally planted Thomas's name where investigators would eventually find it. Not to hide the past, but to direct attention toward it. There's something else, Mills added. We recovered Richard's deleted calendar entries. Anything interesting? Richard had a private meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock last night. No name. Just 2 words. Cross stopped writing. What words? Mills read directly from the recovered entry. The third. Cross's mind returned immediately to the old photograph. 3 founders. 1 missing face. 1 erased history. Richard hadn't been meeting Thomas Avery. He had been expecting the 3rd founder. But if that was true, one question suddenly became far more important than all the others. Why had nobody ever heard his name? And who had worked so hard to erase him from history? Daniel Cross spent the rest of the afternoon searching for someone who officially didn't exist. Company records ended with Richard Halston and Thomas Avery. Newspaper articles celebrated 2 founders. Investor presentations mentioned only 2 names. It was as though the 3rd man had never been part of the company at all. That was impossible. People could disappear. Records could be altered. But memories were harder to erase. Cross requested every employee who had worked for the company during its first 5 years. Only 12 were still alive. Most had retired. A few had moved across the country. 1 agreed to meet immediately. Harold Benson owned a small hardware store outside Tacoma. He had been the company's first systems technician. 71 years old. Sharp memory. Little patience. Harold looked at the old photograph for less than 5 seconds. Someone cut out Nathan. Cross looked up. Nathan? Nathan Cole. Brilliant engineer. The smartest of the 3. Why isn't his name in any company records? Harold laughed once. Because Richard made sure of it. Explain. Harold folded his hands. The company almost collapsed during its first year. Investors wanted out. Nathan discovered someone had been manipulating financial reports. Who? He never got the chance to prove it. Why not? He disappeared. Not long after that, Thomas vanished too. Cross felt the pieces beginning to move. 1 founder disappeared. Then another. Only Richard remained. Did the police investigate Nathan's disappearance? Briefly. They assumed he'd left voluntarily. No body. No evidence. Case closed. Did Nathan have family? A younger sister. Claire. She never believed he ran away. Cross wrote the name down. Claire Cole. Another person history had almost forgotten. As he stood to leave, Harold stopped him. Detective. Yes? Richard wasn't afraid of Thomas. He was afraid of Nathan. Why? Because Nathan kept copies of everything. Every contract. Every agreement. Every financial record. He trusted paper more than people. Cross drove back toward Seattle in complete silence. Richard's calendar entry echoed in his mind. The 3rd. Not Thomas. Nathan. His phone suddenly rang. Lieutenant Mills answered before he could speak. We've got a problem. What happened? Someone broke into Richard Halston penthouse. Again. Cross pressed harder on the accelerator. What was taken? Nothing. At least, nothing valuable. Then why break in? Mills took a slow breath. Because someone left something behind. By the time Cross reached the penthouse, the crime scene had been sealed for a second time. 2 patrol officers stood outside the front door. Neither looked comfortable. "Tell me exactly what happened," Cross said. "The alarm company reported movement inside the apartment at 4:17 this afternoon," one officer replied. "We arrived less than 4 minutes later. The front door was still locked. No one was inside." "No signs of forced entry?" "None." Cross stepped into the apartment. The forensic lights had been switched on again. Nothing appeared disturbed. Until he reached Richard's office. The locked desk drawer where the old photograph had been found was open. Inside lay a single envelope. No stamp. No address. Only 2 handwritten words. "You're late." Cross carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a small brass key. Folded around it was a yellowed receipt dated 21 years earlier. The receipt belonged to a storage facility on the south side of Seattle. Unit 317. "Run the ownership records," Cross said. Lieutenant Mills looked at the receipt. "This place closed years ago." "Buildings close. Storage units don't disappear." An hour later, they stood in front of a weathered warehouse surrounded by rusting chain-link fences. The company name had faded almost completely from the sign. Most of the units had been abandoned for years. Cross stopped in front of Unit 317. The old brass key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Dust filled the air as the metal door rolled upward. There was no furniture. No boxes. No personal belongings. Only a single gray filing cabinet stood against the back wall. Every drawer was locked. The same brass key opened them all. Inside were hundreds of neatly organized documents. Original shareholder agreements. Bank transfers. Meeting notes. Personal journals. Cross pulled out the oldest notebook. The first page was signed by Nathan Cole. He began reading. "Richard says investors only need to see part of the truth. Thomas disagrees. I recorded everything in case one day someone asks what really happened." Cross turned another page. The handwriting became hurried. "If anything happens to me, Richard knows where these files are. Thomas promised he'll protect them." Cross stopped reading. Something didn't fit. If Richard had always known where the documents were, why had they remained hidden for 21 years? His phone rang. It was the crime lab. "Detective, we identified the blood from the burned napkin." "Richard's?" "No. It's female." Cross frowned. "Can you identify her?" "We're running it through the national database now." Before the technician could hang up, another voice was heard in the background. Papers shuffled. Someone shouted. "Detective, we just got a match." Cross waited. The technician spoke slowly, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. "The blood belongs to Claire Cole, Nathan Cole's sister." Cross drove back to headquarters without saying a word. Claire Cole had never appeared in the investigation. Her name wasn't in Richard Halston contacts. There were no recent emails. No phone calls. Yet her blood had been found on the burned napkin inside Richard's kitchen. Lieutenant Mills met him outside the evidence room. "The DNA report just came in." "Tell me." "The blood is about 3 days old. Not fresh. Whoever burned the napkin wasn't trying to hide last night's murder. They were trying to hide an earlier meeting." Cross nodded slowly. Richard had met Claire before he died. The question was why. Within an hour, detectives located Claire's address. A small house north of Seattle. The front yard was overgrown. Newspapers lay untouched on the porch. Cross knocked twice. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. After obtaining permission to enter, the officers stepped inside. The house was spotless. Almost too spotless. Every framed photograph had been removed from the walls. Closets were nearly empty. Kitchen cabinets contained only a few dishes. It looked less like someone lived there, and more like someone had been preparing to leave. Cross searched the living room while Mills examined the upstairs bedrooms. Minutes later, she called down, "Daniel." He hurried upstairs. On the floor of the master bedroom lay an open suitcase. Most of the clothes had already been packed. A passport rested inside. Claire Cole. Age 48. The passport had been issued only 6 weeks earlier. She was planning to disappear, Mills said. Cross wasn't convinced. No. She was planning for something. He searched the bedside table. Inside the top drawer was a small digital voice recorder. The battery was dead. Crime lab technicians recovered the audio less than an hour later. Cross listened through headphones. At first, only silence. Then a woman's voice. "If you're hearing this, something has gone wrong." Claire's voice trembled, but her words remained clear. Richard finally admitted what happened to Nathan. He said it wasn't supposed to end the way it did. He wanted to tell the police everything. Cross leaned forward. "Marcus won't let him," Claire continued. "Richard is terrified of him. He says Marcus has been controlling the company for years." Cross froze. "Marcus?" "If anything happens to Richard," Claire said quietly, "or to me, don't believe his alibi." The recording ended. The room fell completely silent. Lieutenant Mills removed her headphones. Marcus was on live television during the murder. "I know," Cross replied. "That's what makes this recording so important." He replayed Claire's final sentence. "Don't believe his alibi." Cross had learned long ago that an alibi only proved one thing. It proved where someone appeared to be, not necessarily where they had been when the crime was committed. For the first time since the investigation began, Daniel Cross wasn't trying to identify the killer. He was trying to understand how Marcus Doyle had convinced everyone he couldn't possibly be one. Daniel Cross watched Marcus Doyle's television interview 6 times before he noticed it. Not something Marcus said. Something the host said. "We're going to take a short commercial break," the anchor announced. The broadcast faded to advertisements. The timer in the corner of the recording kept running. 3 minutes. 27 seconds. Cross immediately called the television network. "I need every second recorded inside your studio last night." The producer sounded confused. The interview was live. "Except for the commercials. What happened during the break?" An hour later, Cross reviewed the studio's internal security footage. Marcus removed his microphone. An assistant offered him coffee. He declined. Then he disappeared through a hallway leading toward the dressing rooms. Cross checked the timestamps. Marcus was out of view for 2 minutes and 49 seconds. "Where does this hallway lead?" Cross asked. The studio manager pointed to a floor plan. "Private dressing rooms, restrooms, and a rear service exit used by staff." "Does that exit have cameras?" The manager hesitated. "Not anymore." "Why not?" "It malfunctioned 3 weeks ago. Replacement parts were still on order." Cross felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Coincidences rarely stayed coincidences for long. Back at headquarters, he spread every timeline across the conference table. The murder. The interview. The elevator stop. Claire's recording. Nathan's journal. Each clue pointed somewhere. None of them pointed to Marcus pulling the trigger. That was the problem. Cross had become convinced Marcus was responsible. But being responsible wasn't the same as being the shooter. He returned to the medical examiner's report. One sentence caught his attention. The fatal shot had been fired from less than 3 feet away. Richard had known the person standing in front of him. He hadn't tried to run. He hadn't fought back. Who would Richard willingly invite into his home? Cross whispered. The answer came almost immediately. Claire Cole. Cross stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. Richard had arranged the meeting with Claire. They ate dinner together. Richard confessed what had happened to Nathan. Claire's blood reached the napkin during that meeting. Everything fit. Everything except one thing. If Claire had been with Richard, who killed him? Before anyone could answer, Lieutenant Mills hurried into the room. She placed a freshly printed report on the table. "We found Claire." "Alive?" Mills didn't answer immediately. "Barely. She was admitted to a small hospital outside Spokane yesterday morning. She'd been unconscious after what doctors believed was a single-car accident." Cross stared at the report. Yesterday morning. Hours before Richard Halston was murdered. Claire couldn't have been the killer. Daniel Cross reached the hospital just before sunrise. Claire Cole was awake. Weak. Bruised. But very much alive. She looked at Cross for several seconds before speaking. "Richard's dead, isn't he?" Cross nodded. "I need the truth. All of it." Claire closed her eyes. 22 years ago, Nathan discovered Richard wasn't stealing from investors. He was covering for Marcus. Cross remained silent. Marcus had created shell companies and hidden millions through fake consulting contracts. Richard wanted to expose him. Nathan collected proof. What happened? Nathan confronted Marcus. The next day he disappeared. Was he murdered? Tears filled Claire's eyes. "His body was never found. But Richard confessed to me. Marcus killed Nathan and made it look like he ran away." "And Thomas Avery?" "Thomas figured it out. Richard warned him to leave. They staged Thomas's disappearance so Marcus would stop hunting him. Thomas has been living under another identity ever since." Cross finally understood. Thomas's fingerprints weren't left by a ghost. Richard had secretly met him weeks earlier while retrieving old company records. The wine bottle had simply never been cleaned. Someone had later planted Thomas's initials on the napkin to revive an old mystery. "Richard asked me to meet him the night he died," Claire continued. "He wanted to confess everything. He wanted to turn the documents over to the police." "Then why did you leave?" "Because Marcus called Richard. Richard became terrified. He begged me to leave before Marcus arrived. I drove away. About 30 minutes later, someone forced my car off the highway. That's the last thing I remember." Cross looked toward Lieutenant Mills. Marcus hadn't needed Claire dead immediately. He had only needed her unable to speak. Back in Seattle, the final piece fell into place. The television station's rear service exit opened into an underground parking garage. Security cameras covered every vehicle entering. None covered vehicles leaving through the private executive lane. Marcus never left during the commercial break. He didn't have to. Cross requested the station's visitor logs. One name appeared exactly 40 minutes before the interview began. Victor Lang. A former military contractor. Now employed as Marcus Doyle's personal security consultant. The investigation moved quickly. Victor's apartment was searched that afternoon. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a suppressed pistol. Ballistics matched the bullet recovered from Richard Halston's body. Victor confessed within 6 hours. Not because he wanted to. Because Marcus had already transferred millions of dollars overseas and booked a one-way flight out of the country. Victor realized he had been abandoned. According to his statement, Marcus never intended to kill Richard himself. He arranged the dinner. He learned Claire had been invited. When Claire left early, Victor entered the penthouse using a duplicate key supplied by Marcus. Richard knew Victor well enough to let him inside. The shot was fired from less than 3 feet away. Victor removed Claire's dessert plate to hide evidence that she had been there. Marcus later planted false clues pointing toward Thomas Avery, hoping detectives would chase a dead man instead of a living one. Marcus Doyle was arrested before sunset while attempting to board a private jet bound for the Cayman Islands. He never admitted ordering the murder. He didn't have to. The documents from Storage Unit 317, Victor's confession, and decades of financial records told the story for him. 6 months later, Nathan Cole's remains were recovered from an abandoned construction site identified through Victor's testimony. Thomas Avery returned to testify under his real name for the first time in more than 2 decades. Claire finally buried her brother. On the day the trial ended, Daniel Cross stood alone outside the courthouse. Lieutenant Mills joined him. "You know what still bothers me?" she asked. Cross smiled faintly. "The elevator?" She nodded. "Someone called it to an empty floor. Just to make investigators wonder if there had been another way in. A perfect distraction. The simplest clues are often the easiest to believe." Mills laughed. "And the most dangerous." Cross looked toward the Seattle skyline. Perfect alibis didn't exist. Only carefully constructed illusions. Sooner or later, the truth always found a way through them.